do probably is let our panelists quickly introduce themselves and explain who they are, where they come from, and sort of why they're here, really.
Yeah, so I'm Andrew Brem. I'm the Chief Digital Officer of Aviva. I was hired by our CEO partly because I am not from the industry. Insurance and financial services, we believe, needs exploding. It's rather from the Stone Age. My background is actually consumer businesses, like Car Phone Warehouse. I also set up within British Gas a connected homes business under the brand of Hive.
Henry Lane Fox. I do come from a startup background. I've done startups all my life, but most recently got together with Brent to launch Founders Factory, which is a new multi-sector, corporate-backed incubator and accelerator operating in London. We're delighted that Aviva are one of our investors. We also have some other very large groups involved with us.
So I guess let's go straight to the topic of why it's sort of hard for corporates to innovate. So look, my experience of this is I've founded a few internet companies, and then I've been on some big corporate boards. And even when I had my own internet business with 2,000 employees and was the founding CEO, when we got to $2 billion of gross revenues, it was really hard to innovate because it tended to all be about cost savings, quarterly reporting, earnings, and not making mistakes and playing it safe. So I sort of, from the outside, at first entrepreneurs, you look at big corporates and you say, well, they're really just a bunch of muppets. Why can't they innovate? And then you actually go, and I was on the board of The Guardian for 9 years, a large corporate, and also saw, wow, it's sort of hard. So one of the things we've done is look at lots of different models of innovation, but I'll let these two talk about sort of their experiences of looking at some of these models and what works and what doesn't.
Okay, I'm happy to take that one first, Brent. So I guess when we spent a lot of time obviously looking at the market, and with a different hat on, I started a small consultancy that advises quite a lot of big groups on their innovation strategy. And I guess there's 3 or 4 different models that people primarily use when it comes to innovation. There's the classic let's build internally model. I think that is hard for a lot of different reasons. Trying to get the right access to talent is hard within these big organizations. There's a war out there for talent at the moment. It's hard to get the right incentive structures within a large organization. I think there is also a real issue around appetite for risk. I think inevitably that does take on a very different look and feel in a large corporate to an early stage startup. So I think it can be hard to build internally. I think the options people really primarily go with now are trying to co-create new products and services with third parties, whether they happen to be venture builders or individual startups. Trying to run individual corporate accelerators, which is a model we see proliferating all the way across Europe. And then really trying to take the pure venture model. Can you invest either in early stage startups or in the growth rounds of fast scaling startups, and maybe looking at M&A as well? But Andrew, you'll have...
Yeah, I guess, I mean, my personal perspective is that actually there is no single right answer. And the game that we're playing very explicitly is to have 3 main capabilities. One is just straightforward CVC investing. The second is working in partnership. And I guess what we're doing together is a sort of a combination of investing and working in partnership with some startups. And the third is build your own. I think build your own is not easy, but it's absolutely possible. And I think build your own requires probably the most confidence and sort of real confidence from a CEO to let you get on with it. To me, it's all about freedom. It's all about trust. You need a CEO who will say, I'm not going to be all over the detail of this. I have, as it were, an internal founding team. You hire whoever you want. You use the brand you think is right. You go and locate yourself away from the mothership. And just let me know how it's going. And I think one of those people was actually Phil Bentley, who was the CEO of British Gas. Sounds like a very traditional business and kind of is. It was interesting discussing with him in the early days of Hive, what should our performance metrics be? And everyone was saying, yeah, well, obviously sales and so on. He said, there's no way we're going to have sales as a performance metric. What will happen is that we'll throw the baby away with the bathwater. No, I just want you to be famous for remote control of your house. That's all. And we'll judge at the end of the year whether you've come anywhere near achieving that. And I thought that was just a confident approach to leadership, creating new businesses. Because that kind of micromanagement is never going to work.
And how were you able to compete in the war for talent? Because one of the things the cliche I spout is the enemy in corporates is basically HR, because you can't get the payment structures right and the reward incentives right, and ROI, which you've just spoken about in essence. But what about that? Were you able to get the right people?
The answer is yes, and I mean, it's like any business, in particular any startup. You need to be able to tell a really exciting story. I mean, it's fair to say that the people that we're hiring now into Aviva, which is an insurance company, whom I hired into British Gas, did not think they would be telling their friends at the bar that they had just joined an insurance company or an energy company. That wasn't on their game plan at all. But as ever, these guys, whether they be on the commercial or the engineering side, what they love is a really difficult problem that could change society. And in both those cases, we felt that's what we were actually working on. And, you just put it to them, would you rather be playing with 15 million customers or 15,000 customers? And actually they go, hang on a minute, I can actually impact society faster through this route. And that really was the drinking of the Kool-Aid for them.
I think I agree with that, Andrew, and I think I see that in a lot of other companies as well. That if you can combine those two elements of knowing that you have a visionary CEO who's prepared to really support digital innovation, coupled to this idea that there's scale of impact that can be achieved often in a more compressed time frame than in an individual startup. Yeah. I agree with you. I think it's hard, but I don't see any intrinsic reason why you can't find that talent.
I think you also need a CEO that knows that many of his leadership team will be unhappy with the risks that are being taken. And actually, the feedback I got from my boss 3 months in was, this is all very well, Andrew, but I'm not hearing nearly enough complaints about you. And I thought, actually, he's totally got it, right? It's not about being nice.
And I mean, the other question, what about location? Because obviously, so Aviva have a digital garage. I know you said that's overstated in terms of just the location issue, but a lot of large corporates, just one thing they do is they just buy a building and they put some people and they say, don't wear suits, and that's it. But how do you...
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess in our case, it's a not very well kept secret that, our CEO says, well, actually, I want to move the whole business to Hoxton Square. And for him, it's part of blowing up a culture. Has many great attributes as a 320-year-old business, but actually, he wants the whole business to be a little bit more risk-taking, a little bit more edgy, and frankly, to attract a very different sort of talent mix, the best of the old and the best of the new.
Great. And then, Henry, so Founders Factory is a concept that you think helps solve some of what we think, I guess, helps solve some of these issues. Sort of, what do you think is different about it, and why can it help?
So I think there's two really key things around what we're doing at Founders Factory and perhaps what separates us from a lot of the traditional accelerator programs and incubator companies out there. The first is that we've decided to go multi-sector. There is an innate appeal that we've often spoken about trying to recreate the MIT-type magic of having a variety of individuals working on very diverse sets of problems who somehow, by being co-located and sharing each other's experiences, can produce more magic than just if you're focused on one very niche area, perhaps in the world of financial services, perhaps, or indeed in the world of beauty, two industries we operate in. And I think the other element is that we've tried to build out a very robust and quite large-scale operating team, 60 people who are full-time there to support all of the businesses we work with. They're experienced second-time entrepreneurs. Almost everybody we bring into the business has a legacy of having run through successful startups. And I think the learnings they can help teach to young entrepreneurs are sizable, and it goes beyond that kind of mentorship model that a lot of other people deploy.
It might be worth, I see several people in the audience are probably looking at their phones, researching exactly what Founders Factory is and what it does. But for those that aren't, it might be worth describing who are the backers and, and how many companies a year and all that.
So in really simple terms, what we're doing is we're trying to build and scale 200 new technology businesses over the course of the next 5 years. We're doing that operating within 6 sectors: education, media, financial services, beauty, travel, and deep tech, AI and big data. To do that, we've taken investment from some very large corporate, traditional corporates who have great audiences, very, very deep market insight and capital. So we're pleased to have Aviva on board. We also have L'Oreal, the cosmetics giant, EasyJet, the low-cost airline, the Guardian Media Group, Holt Spring Macmillan, and a very large Chinese conglomerate called CSC. And together, we are taking small equity stakes in young, ambitious, entrepreneurially driven businesses, and we'll be doing 150 of those. But we're also co-creating new businesses from scratch together with our corporate investors, where we see opportunities in the market and believe we can deliver an unfair advantage in go-to-market.
And just quickly, since we are in Germany, and obviously there are tremendous German industrial corporations who have done very well over previous generations, but they feel like they're playing catch-up in things like autonomous cars and maybe Industry 4.0 and the various aspects. Any thoughts on whether they can catch up now and why they were so slow to move?
It's a subject I could talk about for a long time. I think I take it as a central premise myself that you're never too late to catch up. I think that the scale of these traditional corporates is still very, very significant. I mean, the very simple conundrum is this. Anybody who's done an early stage startup knows full well that you receive your initial funding, you're beginning to get going, you inevitably look up at the traditional corporates within your sector and think, what if I could have their brand power and their audience size now? What could I do with it? And at the same time, from the corporate side, you tend to find that CEOs of big businesses look down at the startups and go, if only I had your talent, your innovation, your ideas and your drive, what could I do with it? And I don't think there's any reason to think that the two can't be married well. And I think that we're only seeing the beginning of this trend of corporates getting involved in the market. You know, if I take an analogy from one of the perhaps most traditional businesses I've ever advised is a business called Fannie Mae. Fannie Mae is the plumbing behind the mortgage industry in the US, $2 trillion of assets on its balance sheet. It's a business that has had some challenges over the last 10 years, but in the last 12 months, its CEO has decided that digital innovation is going to be put at the heart of that business. And already, frankly, within the first 6 months of working with those, with the teams internally within Fannie Mae, they've already brought such extraordinary scale to some of the startups that they've worked with that there isn't now a venture community anywhere who doesn't look at that model and think, if I could invest in those businesses before those relationships came to be, it will be clear that those businesses would be given a much greater chance of success. So,
yeah, I was going to say, to build on that point, I think there's another ingredient, particularly with very large corporates, which is that the irony is that the crown jewels, which are so valuable, are often surprisingly difficult to access. And in our experience, what you really need to create is a bit of a pre-prepared menu of access to the crown jewels so that you can actually cut through the negotiation that ends up happening internally to make available a set of customers in a sandbox, or in our case, you know, the kind of our proprietary capability in pricing risk, or our balance sheet, or our regulatory approvals, or so on. That's ultimately what these startups really want to have. And actually, the more that those can be put on a pre-arranged plate, the better.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a really good point, because many entrepreneurs that we talk to initially, you start talking about corporates, and they're like, I'm not going to waste my time. I know what it'll be. It'll be a 1 year. I'll go to 10 meetings. No one makes a decision. And it was interesting. Once, Henry and I, we did a thing for, actually, I think it was Glaxo, where we got the 12 decision makers or whatever it was in a room, and then the startups were like, okay, if they're all going to be in the room, we'll fly from all over the world, because we never get these people in a room. We never get a decision. I mean, as it turned out, it was still quite interesting where it went to. But talking about that, you know, I often call it a sort of API into a corporate. Do you think Aviva's done that already? And other companies, what can they learn? If yes, what can other companies learn from how to build that API?
No, we're building the API at the moment. No, we haven't done it already. It was, I guess, one of our learnings since we started working together and set up the garage and so on. And actually, really, it is absolutely a pre-negotiated thing with our full executive team, whether that be a certain amount of risk capital that we just pre-arrange we're going to put on risk, X amount per startup, whether that be specific customers and the protections they got around them. We're building exactly that stuff. Some of it's, I guess, more policy, and some of it is actually technically an API as well. And to be honest with you, for us, it's entirely consistent with our broader digital strategy, the whole creation of APIs anyway. So whether we're creating APIs into our base systems for our digital businesses to use, or whether we're creating them for third-party businesses, it's the same deal.
And Henry, who have you seen that's done well? Or I think you've done some work with Diageo and Unilever and people like that about to some extent, an API.
Absolutely. So I'm lucky to have sat around too many boardrooms, perhaps, in the last couple of years and seen people do this up close. I think maybe rather than talking around specific examples, because we probably all know who they are, I think I always look at successful examples and identify 2 or 3 characteristics. And I think the first one's a very, very simple point. But it does take a leadership team who actually have quite a clear set strategy for what they're trying to achieve with digital, who end up succeeding. There are a lot of corporates out there who will try to work with technologies because it's ticking a box in an innovation agenda. They're chasing a new shiny object that perhaps their marketing team want to try to deploy. But there isn't a very clear vision for what they're actually trying to achieve. There's a whole host of innovation that you could undertake when you have a business of significant scale. And I think trying to understand exactly the best way to try to work through a series of easy goals to get to an end state that everybody buys into is probably the most important thing. And I think a second point back to Andrew's, which I completely agree with, is making sure that everybody internally has an understanding of the right process that is going to be required to work with early stage businesses. It isn't as simple as it sounds. Everybody knows there are probably got horror stories amongst the audience. Certainly we could sit here and list them all day long. So having as much of a clearly defined structure as possible. And then the third bit is really a very simple one as well, which is outreach to the market and telling people that you're open for business. Making, back to your point, it very clear what the value exchange can be between the early stage startups and the corporates. And I think there are people who have done that piece very well. I think Aviva do that well. I think you're right, Unilever make a big play around it. I think Diageo have also done that well. I think a lot of the big CPG groups actually have looked at this, although primarily from their side to date, it's been around the marketing and ad tech technologies rather than the core reinvention of the business model. I think we're beginning to see more of that in financial services, and obviously the media groups are pretty good examples.
Just wondering if there are any questions, then please do raise your hand, otherwise I'll keep going. Anyone? Burning questions? Otherwise, no. I was also thinking that talking about sort of innovation staying ahead, there was somebody quoted the other day saying that every large corporate needs a chief AI officer. Do you think, is that part of the puzzle these days, or is that the right way to go about it? I mean, facing a future trend like that people say could transform everyone's business, or is that not?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of chief officers going around at the moment, it has to be said. I suppose, I think there's some generic areas, such as the whole sales, customer service thing, where absolutely it's totally applicable. But I think sometimes AI and certainly analytics that underpin it actually could have a more existential impact on an industry. And in fact, in the case of our industry in insurance, we totally think that. I mean, our entire industry has really been based on an assumption that a small number of factors are strong predictors of risk. And the reality, as we access a lot more data, more computing power, and then can apply AI to that is, of course, that's basically nonsense. And in fact, we look the same, sort of, but of course, what our public and third-party data reveals is that we are not remotely the same. And so I think sometimes applying, AI and other database technologies in some industries is actually just going to be just really question the core of what they are.
I mean, as you know, I'm not a big believer in titles, so I'm not sure whether I'd quite go with the Chief AI Officer. I think there is a fundamental point here, and Andrew gets to the heart of it as well, that there is a lack of understanding around machine learning in the boardroom and at the senior executive level. And given the fact that this is unquestionably a transformative technology that will affect everybody's industries, having that actual understanding of what it means when we're talking about machine learning and what the opportunities are for an individual business to benefit from increasing levels of compute power and open data are important. But I think it's an education process for me that's the most important element, rather than necessarily giving somebody a title and saying, hey, great, perfect, job done, we have a Chief AI Officer. The real question for me is how you're going to build up an integrated digital data strategy within a business and learn where the opportunities are, and indeed some of the risks and threats around deploying machine learning technologies.
And then just going to a sort of negative now. So some corporates, well, I don't know how much you can talk about it, but some will be public, but corporates that have really failed, spent large amounts of money on innovation and got absolutely nothing to show for it. Can we talk about any of those? Or if you really can't, then you can talk about some successes.
I'm not sure how easy it is to name names. I think maybe I could I'll try and abstract it a little bit, and I'll give you an example of a business that is very connected to the European financial infrastructure. They set up their own incubation teams. They did this a while back in an attempt, frankly, to replicate products that were already on the market with fast-growth, scaling startups. They looked at them with some envy, thought they were being disrupted, chose not to invest or acquire those businesses, but thought, we can build it ourselves. And in doing that, there were a business that had spent over 500 million euros in developing what was, frankly, an MVP that had in the low thousands of customers. And it was a project I was brought in to advise on about a year ago, and I think nothing has really upset me more than seeing the enormous waste of money that had been put to develop a project in a silo. There was no external validation for anything they were building. They hadn't gone about trying to build an MVP in the traditional fashion at all. They had assumed they had a right to win in a market in which they were a very large player. And they look at it now, thankfully that project has been stopped, but they just lost a massive opportunity where they could have been working in partnership with startups. They could have, frankly, acquired two of the largest startups that now exist within financial services for the sum of money they ended up deploying. So I think there are numerous examples of it. I think it tends to happen when you have a misunderstanding of a market and the wrong type of talent in a business.
What I've seen happen more often is, frankly, juggling too many half-pregnant projects, basically. That's my observation of innovation going wrong in corporates. And my personal learning is just massively back a couple of big horses. And if that's my default. And so I've seen too many situations where you've got sort of endless concept development without killing the concepts and picking the one or two that you're actually going to get behind in a big way.
Yeah, I guess that would be where Google X would talk about how structured they are about killing projects they put quite a lot of money into and when they go to do that. I mean, thinking about incubation projects from corporates that have worked. I mean, you mentioned Hive already. I guess we could talk about TalkTalk. But other ones, I mean, Tinder is an example, Dollar Shave Club. Are there many others that are worth highlighting?
Not that many, if I'm honest. I think in simple terms, I still think we haven't seen the best of traditional corporates yet. I often cite Sky. I think that Sky's OTT platform actually is remarkably successful, probably better than any startup that's on the market. But they're very collaborative in how they work, and they've been very sensible in the way they've leveraged their big audience onto a new platform. But I think it is hard to find examples. People often cite the way things like Shopkick got going with the help of Best Buy. It's not completely public, but that was very much in a sort of quasi-corporate incubated business. That did get some scale and sold. So there are some examples, but there's a litany of failures, I'm afraid, still. Yeah,
I mean, it occurs to me that I don't know how digital these are necessarily, but they're almost diffusion brands that have been created quite effectively. So I'm thinking low-cost airlines spun off from the major airlines, for example, or retailers tend to do it. I mean, that's my sense, that almost having a baby that's sort of slightly differently shaped that you then spin off is perhaps
but there are many that don't work either, right? So you look at Go, I don't think Go was deemed a success, right? The airline that EasyJet sort of almost got absorbed into EasyJet. I'm not sure they got much for it. But yeah, I'm trying to think of others. I mean, I think Dollar Shave Club is interesting from an incubator. It's not from a corporate. And Tinder, but that was just a corporate-backed incubator, wasn't it?
Yeah.
We've done it. We've done it in creating a purely digital insurance brand, actually, which basically we were just very clear on which elements we were going to leverage from the mothership, as it were, the balance sheet and so on.
Yes.
And then we send the other 40 people off to work in a different location to create a new brand.
So similar to GiftGaff in a sense.
Exactly. So I guess my observation from those would be, limited though it is those are quite clear. They're a very clear strategy, but clearly related to the original business model.
I think we're almost out of time and everyone needs lunch. So any other concluding remarks you'd like to put out, guys?
Well, I'll just give you one interesting example, and I think we're beginning to see it now, and since you've mentioned Dollar Shave Club, I'll make a guess. I think in the next 2 years, what we're really going to see a lot more of is actually very big traditional corporates suddenly deciding that they can acquire at-scale businesses. And I think this is a trend that is going to benefit Europe, actually. I think there's far too few likely exits for tech companies so far, and I think that's beginning to change as people sit with enormous amounts of cash on their balance sheet, faced by the fact that digital is now a reality and not just a pie-in-the-sky dream. So I'm going to make a bet that the acquisitions in Europe are going to increase from traditional corporates over the next few years.
And on my part, what I'm hoping, and would make a bet, is actually some of the most successful ideas are going to be cross-sectoral collaboration. The bottom line is people from in their own industry don't always have the novel ideas for that industry, and hiring talent is only one way of accessing them.
Great. Well, I think the cross-sector angle is a brilliant way to finish. So thank you, Andrew, because that is exactly the theory we've got behind Founders Factory, that we can invent more at scale by thinking across sector, and that's where we can get true innovation happening. So thank you, all of you, for delaying your lunch. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.